Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Now, do student protests matter? Do they achieve anything? Did the global anti-apartheid movement protest, did they help to remove apartheid? Let's take a look. Student protests are spreading across the world, and people are making comparisons to the anti-apartheid movement, which they believe led to the end of apartheid. So the two questions I'd like to address are, number one, do protests make a difference? And number two, did the anti-apartheid movement lead to the abolition of apartheid? You may be surprised to learn the answer to the second of the questions, and so like the channel and subscribe so you don't miss out on new material I put out with regards to Muslim political activism. Student protests are taking place across the world, from America to Australia, and they're highlighting the genocide which is taking place in Palestine, and that this genocide is not only taking place by the Zionists, but it is being supported by Western powers, their corporations, and even in some cases universities. These protests have become global, and young people and the not so young people, the black, the white, the Muslim, the non-Muslims, everybody is getting involved. And in these protests there is the echo of the global anti-apartheid movement which took place, which led to the abolition of apartheid in 1994. So these student protests are calling for the boycott of various brands, urging universities and companies to divest from the Zionist colony and the occupation and the genocide, calling for boycott, disinvestment, sanctions, and calling for the end of military aid to the Zionist occupation in Palestine. So it's a good moment to look at the anti-apartheid movement which took place across the world over a number of decades prior to the fall of the apartheid in South Africa. The anti-apartheid movement was a global movement, and it touched popular culture, capturing the imagination of people across the world. And this boycott movement actually began in the 1950s within South Africa.
In Johannesburg, thousands of coloured people went to attend a protest meeting called by the African National Congress.
In 1959, the South African exiles in the UK began the international anti-apartheid movement to boycott South Africa. In 1962, the United Nations General Assembly passed a resolution to boycott South Africa. In 1960s, South Africa was barred from FIFA and Olympic competitions. In the 1970s and 80s, musicians, academics refused to perform or engage with South Africa. And in the 80s, there was even sanctions placed against South Africa. And popular culture embraced this movement. There was concerts, there was rallies, there was marches. Public places were named after South African icons like Mandela. In 1998, on the 70th birthday of Nelson Mandela, there was a march from Finsbury Park to Hyde Park, which I myself took part in. So the anti-apartheid movement was huge, and its aim was to remove apartheid. However, what was to replace it wasn't agreed upon. So the ANC and the PAC agreed what the problem was. The problem was apartheid. However, they didn't agree upon what a solution would look like. The ANC collaborated with the South African Communist Party. Even many members of the South African ANC were communists themselves, Marxists. The PAC, on the other hand, was a patriotic Pan-African movement against imperialism. So they all agreed on the problem, but they didn't have clarity on what a solution would look like. So in the face of this massive global movement, massive protests taking across capitals of Western nations, the Western governments continued to support and protect the apartheid regime until its last days. South Africa was a trusted Western capitalist ally the Western world could rely upon. So what role did the anti-apartheid movement play? They played a huge role in highlighting the crime and persecution that was taking place in South Africa, the oppression, the official racism on a day-to-day basis suffered by all non-white people living in South Africa. They were incredibly successful in making apartheid toxic. Even celebrities got involved in highlighting the crimes being committed by the apartheid regime. And now this voice was very difficult for Western governments to control. Why? Because these movements and these protests were outside the political process. It was difficult for them to control and manage these voices. So what the West did was to use the propaganda of communism, the fear of communism coming to South Africa, in order to justify their support of apartheid. Just like they use Islamic radicalism and terrorism in order to justify the support of despotic regimes in the Middle East and the support of the Zionist colony in Palestine. So the anti-apartheid movement agreed about the problem, but they didn't agree upon a solution. So the protests were in opposition to apartheid, but they weren't in support of a clear defined solution, other than support for vague ideals. So they were incredibly successful in creating opposition to apartheid. They made apartheid toxic, but they didn't create an opinion for what they wanted. There was no crystallized, clear solution of what victory would look like. And in the absence of that, the existing Western global powers decided what a new South Africa would look like. So did the protest lead to the end of apartheid? You'll be surprised to learn that all the boycotting that took place and all the protests that took place created an opinion against apartheid. But this in itself did not lead to the end of apartheid because the Western powers supported it till the very end. What actually led to the end of apartheid was the fall of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War. And the Soviet Union collapsed because of its adventure in Afghanistan and the defeat at the hands of the Mujahideen. This led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. And once the Soviet Union collapsed, the Western propaganda of the fear of communism entering into Africa could no longer be maintained. And so the justification for supporting apartheid no longer existed. So now the West had to manage the change. So in the face of the opposition to apartheid, the Western powers managed the change. And they managed the change in their favor to protect their interests. They had the final say on what a new South Africa would look like. They had the final say on what the solution would be. So they compromised on everything they could compromise on, but the red lines were not allowed to be crossed.
It's in the Freedom Charter of 1956, which says that the resources of South Africa would be used for the people of South Africa. The precious resources of South Africa still remained in the hands of the very few white elite post-apartheid, to the extent that here in this country, Mrs. Thatcher's son moved to South Africa. Lady Diana Spencer's brother moved to South Africa because the tax rates were so favorable if you had wealth. The issue is the reason we love Nelson Mandela is because he made a deal with the white elites, the power structures, the De Beers, the Oppenheimers, to remain in power, and he wouldn't touch their wealth, he wouldn't share their wealth, and that's why we in England love him, because the press tells us to. He betrayed the people of South Africa.
I think you captured it very well. There's no any better explanation than the explanation you have given.
So Mandela was told very clearly, if you want one vote, one man, one vote, you can have that. You want democracy, you can have that. But you cannot be in control of the capital and you cannot change the economic system. And Mandela accepted to this and the West managed the change. So yes, in South Africa, there may not be apartheid today, but the miserable lives the vast majority of the people live there still exists. So creating opposition to the ills of society is one thing, but creating an opinion for what victory would look like was something that these protests did not do. Success was a collection of vague ideals. So in the absence of a clear vision of what victory would look like, the protests managed to create opposition to apartheid, but they did not help to shape what victory would look like. And that was taken by the Western powers. So there is a very important lesson here for Muslims. When we protest and when we create opinion against the munkar that exists in society, that is only half a job. We also have to create a clear vision of what the ma'ruf is. So we need to create an opinion of what victory looks like. Victory is not just the absence of munkar. Victory is the existence of ma'ruf. The munkar is indeed the occupation, not just of the Zionists, but the occupation of global capitalism across the world, especially the Muslim world. Victory for us is the establishment of Islam and the existence of Islamic political system and the Islamic justice that it entails. And history shows that clearly only Islam has been able to create a society in Palestine where it created relative harmony between the various different groups, the Christians, the Jews, the Muslims, and the other ethnic and religious groups. And in the 1500-year history, the only two times this harmony has been punctuated is by the Crusaders and the Zionists. So there is only one solution that has worked, and there is only one solution that will work. So we Muslims, not only do we have to create opposition to Zionism and capitalism, we have to create a clear vision of what victory looks like. And victory for us is the establishment of ma'ruf, not just the absence of munkar. We need to establish Islam, and the existence of Islam in practical term means the establishment of the Khilafah political system. Because if we don't do that, just like the Western powers hijacked the protests against anti-apartheid and shaped the solutions to protect her interest, they will do exactly the same now. And they will give you a two-state solution to protect their interest, or they will give you another secular Arab state to add to the many other failed secular Arab states that already exist. And that's not what we want, and that is not what victory looks like. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد والحمد لله رب العالمين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.